So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of classical conditioning. The conditional response, as we saw, might spread to similar stimuli. This is called generalization. And the conditional response can also go away. We'll see that this is called extinction. A definition of generalization is that when you learn about one thing, you tend to treat similar things in a similar way. So that's really what generalization means. It means that we're treating similar things in a similar way. We are generalizing. And an example that uses classical conditioning would be if you're bitten by a German Shepherd, you might also become afraid of some other dogs. And so what we're looking at here is a graph that's going to show us how large the amount of fear is. So I'm going to add a y-axis to our graph. This y-axis might just be, sort of the amount of fear or anxiety that you might feel in the presence of one of these animals here. So we can see that a German Shepherd would produce the greatest amount of fear. But notice that these other dogs, a Labrador, and a Collie, also produce pretty comparable levels of fear, don't they? And so here we see an example of generalization from the German Shepherd to similar types of dogs, right? Now notice a very different animal like a horse, there's no generalization, it's just too different. And so we can think of that as an example of what's called discrimination. A horse or a turkey or an ostrich or whatever it might be, any animal that is really sufficiently different from a German Shepherd will not produce any fear. So we can see that that's an example of discrimination. And so to discriminate in this context, in the context of classical conditioning, just means to treat something as being different. To discriminate means to see the difference or notice the difference between two or more things. In other words, you're not generalizing. Another example of something that can happen with classical conditioning is what's called extinction, where the conditional response can basically go away. It may not last forever, it may not last for your whole life. And so extinction means that you can get rid of a conditional response, and the way you do it is by presenting that conditional stimulus over and over and over without the unconditional stimulus. So let's think a little bit about the example we just did with the dog. So got bit by a German Shepherd. German Shepherd in this case would be the conditional stimulus. The bite would be the unconditional stimulus. So what would that look like if we presented the CS without the US? Well, the person would just have to be around a German Shepherd that didn't bite, right? And that's exactly what extinction would be. How about for Myra with the ice cream truck? What would make her stop reacting to the jingle of the bell, perhaps? Pretend that one of her neighbors, started driving around in their car blasting the same type of music but didn't have ice cream. If that really happened to poor Myra, she would pretty quickly learn that, oh, this little jingle, it does not always mean ice cream. She would probably extinguish. And if we think about the teacher that yelled at the student example, the student just has to be around the teacher and around school without any of the unconditional stimulus, without any of the yelling that maybe they experienced. Extinction is where you can get rid of a conditional response through a process where you have to face the thing that you're afraid of. If it's a fear conditioning situation. So if it's something that's involved or it's produced a conditioned response that's kind of fearful or anxiety-like, then you have to face your fear. So kind of use face your fear as sort of a way to remember what extinction involves. You can't avoid German Shepherds. You can't avoid teachers if you're going to get over your fear of those things. You have to be around them in an environment that is safe. So that's typically, how we would use the term extinction. We have here just a simple graph. Again, on the y-axis, we have the size of the conditional response. Now here, earlier, because we're talking about a dog bite, I said that it was fear, but it could really be whatever the conditioned response is. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, it was salivating. In the case of Myra and the ice cream truck, it was going and getting money so that you can get some ice cream. And perhaps in the case of the student with the teacher, the conditional response then was feeling embarrassed or anxious. So the conditional response can be any number of different things. And what we see is that there's different stages to classical conditioning. Initially, we have this process of acquisition, which is just the learning process, and it, goes gradually up. And so acquisition is the period of time when the learning is going on. This may happen very quickly in just one event, like for the example of the teacher yelling at the student. That may only happen once. It might be enough. For other things, maybe there are multiple pairings. So it might be with Myra and the ice cream truck, maybe it's after the 4th or 5th time that she's seen the ice cream truck and maybe managed to flag it down and get ice cream that she's really made that connection. And maybe with Pavlov's dogs, maybe it was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times before they connected the bell with the food that they were getting. So that acquisition, again, might take one experience or it might take multiple experiences. But at some point, the person or other animal develops this conditional response and the response kind of stays at a certain level. It doesn't keep going up. Why? There's only so much that a dog can salivate. There's only so many things Myra can do to go and get ice cream, and so on. So there's only so much embarrassment or anxiety a person can really feel in a given situation. So that's what we mean by asymptote. The response gets to this point where it really stops growing in any substantial way. The curve just sort of flattens out. At this point in time where this dark line is, we've implemented extinction. Now the CS, the conditional stimulus, is presented alone. In the case of the teacher, the student sees the teacher often, but she no longer yells. So there's no unconditional stimulus, and what happens then is eventually the student's anxiety and embarrassment, sense of embarrassment, will decline. And it's going to start to go down, and that's the process of extinction. Is extinction the same as forgetting or undoing the learning? And the answer is absolutely not. It's not forgetting and unlearning. So there's lots of evidence for this. One piece of evidence, it comes from something called spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery is the return of a conditional response after the person has taken a break. So what this is saying is that if we have gone through this extinction process, what can happen is after a substantial break in time, that conditional response might return all of a sudden. So here's a little example. In the conditioning phase, this dog has learned to expect food when it hears the bell. So this is very similar to Pavlov's dog, right? Bell rings, food is given. The dog definitely has this connection then, this association between the bell and food. And so he salivates and gets excited, runs to his bowl, and so on. After extinction, he's hearing the bell, but he's not getting any more food. No more food. He wants the food. So that's where we see here, oh, to hell with your bell, right? He's gone through the process of extinction, and now the bell no longer makes him excited, no longer makes him go to his bowl. Well, what can happen is that if family goes away on vacation for some period of time, and then when they return, they might ring the bell, and they might see that the dog remembers that the bell was associated with food and go running back to the food bowl to see if food's been delivered. So that conditional response of salivating and running to the food bowl can just return after this break, and that's spontaneous recovery. Now, another thing that can happen is that we can experience what's called disinhibition after extinction. So this is another reason that we know that extinction is not the same as unlearning or forgetting. It does not undo that experience. Disinhibition is when the extinguished conditional stimulus, so the bell, for example, is presented now with a totally new stimulus. The new stimulus doesn't have to be important. It can just be a light or a tone or anything like that. So if the dog hears the bell ring again, but now it's followed by the sound of the door, he may run back to his bowl. In other words, extinction is sort of fragile, huh? It can be undone and the response will return if you just take a break with spontaneous recovery, or it can be undone and the conditional response can return if the CS is paired now with just some other new stimulus, and that would be disinhibition. Another thing that can happen is called renewal. Renewal can happen when an extinguished conditional stimulus, an extinguished CS, like the bell, is found back in its original context. Now, this is more applicable when the extinction happened in a different place. So imagine that our puppy here is, trained to come running when he gets food by, here's the bell and gets his food, here's the bell and gets his food. And then the family maybe moves to another house in another neighborhood or something, and at some point in this new house, they extinguish him. They ring the bell and he doesn't get any more food. Ring the bell, doesn't get any more food. So eventually gets extinguished. What happens if the family goes back and maybe stays with the grandparents in the original home, and then they ring the bell? Oh my gosh, renewal is going to happen. Back in the original home, in the original context where this conditioning happened, you ring that bell and sure enough, the dog will probably respond again. Renewal is really relevant for human therapy because if a person has been in a car accident or through some other trauma and they go through therapy, they can get much better, and that would be in many cases an example of extinction, right? But when they return to maybe the original intersection where the car accident happened, the fear might return. The fear might get renewed again. So that could be an example of renewal, right? So the return to the original context where the association happened, where the conditioning happened, can make that response come back, even though there had been extinction. As you can see, we've had examples of conditioning that involve positive as well as negative unconditional stimuli. Your reading describes just how we can kind of classify these as either appetitive or aversive. Appetitive often makes us think of food, right? Appetite. So that's a good way kind of to remember that, although it's not exclusively food related. So appetitive conditioning might involve something like ice cream, but it might also involve laughter or a hug, other things that are also pleasant. It doesn't have to be food. Aversive conditioning, pretty self-explanatory, right? It involves something that's unpleasant or aversive. The classic example is often shock. It could be damaged carpet. That's an example from your reading, being yelled at, or a puff of air to the eye. So the damaged carpet, remember, was the guy, Dan, who left the window open, and so the rain got into the house and damaged the carpet.